You sit and you analyze the picture and see, do I have her eyes? Do I have her cheekbones? Do I look like her at all? I just grew up thinking that she just could not handle the responsibility of being a mother, and she left. We could never understand why she never came back.
Police believe that actually might be the case, and she left Tammy with her mom and then just disappeared.
They thought she had died. For over 4 decades, her name had faded into whispers, a young mother of 3 who disappeared without a goodbye, leaving behind diapers, dishes, and an unfinished life in a small Indiana town. Some thought she ran. Others feared the worst. Her family lived in the shadows of a mystery so deep, so silent, it nearly swallowed them whole. But what if the truth was stranger than fiction? What if she hadn't been kidnapped or murdered or lost in some tragic accident? What if she had simply chosen to vanish, to erase herself completely and start over under a brand new name, in a brand new life, hundreds of miles away? This is the true story of Lula Gillespie-Miller, a 28-year-old woman who walked away from her entire world in 1974, leaving behind her infant daughter, 2 older children, and a trail that would go cold for 42 years. And when she was finally found, not only alive but living quietly in a completely different state, the world had to ask, why did she disappear? Why did she stay gone? And what happens when a missing person decides they don't want to be found? To understand how one woman could vanish and be rediscovered 4 decades later, we have to go back, way back, to where the trail first went dark. Lula wasn't a criminal. She wasn't a fugitive. She wasn't even the kind of person who seemed capable of running away from her responsibilities. In fact, she was a mother, a daughter, a quiet, polite woman from Laurel, Indiana, a town so small it barely registered on a map. But beneath her quiet exterior was something deeper, something heavy, something unraveling. In 1974, Lula had just given birth to her 3rd child, but the weight of new motherhood, combined with intense emotional distress and an overwhelming sense of entrapment, became unbearable. According to those close to her, she had expressed a feeling of being suffocated, as though she was drowning in the role of motherhood. One source later said she told a relative, "I feel like I wasn't meant to be a mom. I'm lost." But no one expected her to actually leave. And yet, one day, Lula packed a small bag, left her infant daughter in the care of her parents, and simply vanished. No note, no call, no explanation, just gone. Police were notified. A missing persons report was filed, but with no sign of foul play, no suspicious evidence, and no vehicle traced to her, Lula Gillespie-Miller became another name in a filing cabinet, forgotten by all but the family she left behind. Her daughter, Tammy, would grow up with questions that clawed at her heart. Was her mother dead? Kidnapped? Did she run from someone, or toward something? Did she ever think of her, of them? As the years passed, the case turned ice cold. Generations moved on. Lula's parents aged. Her children became adults. And still, silence. But Tammy never stopped searching. As DNA genealogy tools became more advanced and databases grew more accessible, she pushed harder. She submitted DNA to every site she could. She posted in forums. She worked with volunteer investigators. She kept believing her mother might be alive, even when everyone else had accepted she was probably not. Then in 2016, a miracle. A Texas-based investigator, working off a decades-old missing persons report, uncovered an identity that didn't quite fit. A woman with almost no online footprint, no birth certificate on file, no digital history before the 1980s. But the photo, the face, something about her was familiar. They ran the DNA, compared it to Tammy's. It matched. After 42 years, Lula Gillespie-Miller, once thought dead, was found alive in South Texas, living under an assumed name. She had created a new life, a new identity, a quiet existence, far away from the past she abandoned. She wasn't in trouble. She wasn't hiding from the law. She had simply chosen, as strange as it sounds, to disappear. And when law enforcement finally reached out to her, she agreed to speak, but she made one thing heartbreakingly clear. She didn't want to be reunited with her family. Not yet. She wasn't ready. Imagine being Tammy, finally getting the answer you've waited your entire life to hear, only to learn that the person you were searching for doesn't want to see you. But Tammy, she handled it with grace. With heartbreak, yes, but also with understanding. In interviews, she expressed deep love, respect, and even forgiveness. She said, "I just needed to know she was alive. That was enough for now." This story, unlike most missing persons cases, didn't end in tragedy. It didn't end with police tape or a shallow grave. It ended with something both harder and more profound. Choice. A mother chose to leave, a daughter chose to search, and both, in their own way, found something resembling peace. But this case raises bigger questions about mental health, about motherhood, about freedom, and about what it really means to disappear in America. Because sometimes, the people who vanish don't do so because they were taken. Sometimes, they walk away because they're broken. And sometimes, being found is only the beginning of the hardest part. They say time heals all wounds. But for the family Lula left behind, time was never a healer. It was a thief. It stole birthdays, first steps, graduations. It robbed her children of bedtime stories, scraped knees, in the irreplaceable bond only a mother can provide. And the longer she stayed gone, the more surreal her absence became. She stopped being a person and started becoming a question, a ghost, a void in the shape of a woman. Her daughter Tammy, who had grown up in the care of Lula's parents, carried the weight of abandonment like an invisible scar. Imagine being told as a child, your mother loved you, but she couldn't stay. What do you do with that? What does that mean to a child who just wants to be held? Tammy became obsessed, in the quiet, determined way that trauma often hides. She dug through public records, contacted private investigators, joined forums for families of the missing. Lula's name was never in the headlines, but to Tammy, she was the only story that mattered. She'd look at strangers in the street and wonder, could that be her? It wasn't just that Lula left, it was how she left. No closure, no note, no trace. Like a magic trick that never explained its secret, she just evaporated. But let's rewind, because Lula didn't leave in the middle of a storm or a scandal. She wasn't running from danger, according to the evidence. She was running from herself, or rather from the life she felt buried by. And back in 1974, women like Lula had very few options. In a small town like Laurel, Indiana, if you were a mother, that was your identity, your world, your box. Any desire to be more, or to be elsewhere, was considered selfish, even shameful. But what if the box felt like a prison? According to her family, Lula was showing signs of postpartum depression, though back then, they didn't have a name for it. It was simply called being emotional or overwhelmed. No treatment, no conversation, no support. So when Lula made the choice to leave, to vanish, she may have felt it was her only way out. What happened next is astonishing. She didn't go to a shelter or disappear into homelessness. She created an entirely new life under an assumed identity. According to investigators, Lula moved to Texas, where she eventually found low-profile work and kept her head down. She paid rent. She worked basic jobs. She was never arrested, never on the grid. She lived like a ghost with bills, real, but unreachable. And yet she left no trail. In a world before digital footprints, she mastered the art of invisibility. Meanwhile, back in Indiana, Lula's parents raised Tammy. They too were trapped in an emotional purgatory, mourning a daughter they couldn't bury, hoping for someone they couldn't reach. As the years turned to decades, hope started to feel cruel, until 2014, when Tammy connected with a volunteer group that specialized in cold cases, specifically missing adults. That connection would become the breakthrough that rewrote history. The group, using advanced genealogy databases, facial age progression tools, and good old-fashioned investigative legwork, zeroed in on a woman living under an alias in Texas. The woman fit Lula's general description, But could it be her? Police were contacted. DNA was collected. Tension mounted. And then, the results came in. It was her. Lula Gillespie-Miller was alive. It had been 42 years. The news was met with celebration and heartbreak, because as much as Tammy had longed for this moment, the next part would hurt even more. Lula didn't want to be found, not because she hated her family, not because she was hiding from justice, but because in her mind, that chapter of her life was closed, like an old book she had shelved and never dared open again. She told authorities she had no desire to reconnect. She said she was at peace, but her peace had come at the cost of someone else's pain. This revelation sparked fierce debate online. Some people condemned Lula, calling her selfish, cold, even cruel. Others defended her, arguing that mental health, societal pressure, and emotional despair can drive people to extremes. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Both sides were right. Lula was a woman in pain, but she was also a mother who made a choice that changed lives forever. Tammy, ever the embodiment of grace, respected her mother's boundaries. She said, "I know she's alive. I know she's safe, and maybe that's the only closure I'll ever get. But it's enough." Think about that. After 42 years of silence, a daughter finally finds her mother, and instead of a tearful reunion, she gets a closed door and a quiet thank you for respecting it. What do you do with that kind of ending? Maybe you tell the story, because in telling it, you give voice to the voiceless. You remind people that not all missing persons cases end in crime scenes. Some end in choice, in reinvention, in exile, and sometimes, in the hardest kind of peace. So here's the question everyone asks when they hear Lula's story: why didn't she ever come back? It's a haunting question. The kind that sinks into your bones. The kind of question that keeps family members up at night, playing mental chess with every possible answer. Did she feel ashamed? Was she too far gone to return? Or had she, in some twisted way, convinced herself she was protecting her daughter by staying away? Psychologists who study voluntary disappearances, especially among women in the 1970s, offer chilling insight. For many, vanishing wasn't an act of cowardice. It was an act of survival. Lula wasn't just escaping a small town. She was escaping expectation. She was told who to be: a wife, a mother, a caregiver, before she even had time to decide who she was. The 1970s weren't kind to women who felt trapped in domestic roles. There were no mental health hotlines, no support networks, no safe spaces for overwhelmed young mothers to simply say, "I can't do this." So some ran. They left homes, names, entire lives, and they buried the past as deeply as they could, hoping never to look back. But in Lula's case, the past found her anyway. What makes this story even more gripping is that she didn't disappear to paradise. She didn't run off with a lover or start a glamorous new career. She lived modestly, using false names, surviving in plain sight, a drifter in her own country. According to law enforcement, Lula moved around Texas for years, town to town, never staying too long, never drawing attention. She often worked under-the-table jobs, farms, diners, seasonal shifts, always in the background. She was a ghost among the living, and yet in a tragic twist, even in her isolation, she couldn't completely outrun the past. Authorities say she kept a single box of keepsakes, old letters, a locket, and one faded photograph of a baby girl, Tammy. No name on the photo, but she kept it, for decades. So the idea that she forgot, that she moved on coldly, that doesn't quite hold up. Maybe Lula believed her presence would only complicate her daughter's life. Maybe she convinced herself that disappearing was an act of mercy, twisted as that sounds. And when the investigators finally tracked her down and confronted her with the evidence, she didn't deny who she was. In fact, her response was calm, measured. She simply said, "I didn't think anyone was still looking." Let that sink in. Over 4 decades had passed, and somewhere inside her, Lula believed she'd been forgotten, or worse, that she deserved to be forgotten. But Tammy never gave up. Not once. She searched for a ghost and found her mother. And even when Lula declined to reunite, Tammy showed compassion that defied logic. She didn't lash out. She didn't rage. She said, "I'm glad she's alive. That's what matters. Maybe that's all that ever mattered." And just like that, Lula's story became something bigger than one woman's disappearance. It became a lens through which we view all the other missing adults who vanish without a trace. Not victims of crime, but of circumstance, of identity, of overwhelming emotional weight. You may not know this, but according to national statistics, tens of thousands of adults go missing voluntarily every year. Many are never heard from again. Some are found decades later, like Lula, living quietly, often under new names, with stories they rarely share. It's not always about crime. Sometimes it's about control, taking back some sense of power in a world that felt suffocating. But the consequences ripple outward, and the ones left behind carry the weight. Tammy's quiet resilience in this story is one of the most powerful things you'll ever hear. She waited a lifetime for an answer, and when she got it, she chose peace over revenge. She said, "I know my mother's alive. I know she has her reasons, and I can live with that." That's not weakness. That's strength. And Lula, whether she ever opened that door again or not, her name was no longer a whisper in the dark. It became a story, a headline, a lesson, and in some strange, bittersweet way, maybe that was enough. After 42 years of silence, Lula Gillespie-Miller's name wasn't just back in the news, it was everywhere. Headlines screamed, "Missing mother found alive after 4 decades." Indiana woman re-emerges from her own grave. Daughter searches for mom. Finds her after 42 years. The public was captivated, not just by the shock, but by the mystery. Why would a young mother disappear like that? What could drive someone to abandon everything? And how does a person stay hidden for so long? TV anchors, true crime podcasts, news channels, all of them were scrambling to piece together Lula's story. And here's what made it even more extraordinary. There was no criminal case, no court appearance, no charges. Just a woman, fragile, older, quieter now, sitting in a small room in Texas, asked to explain a decision she made as a 28-year-old that haunted 3 generations of her family. But here's where the story takes another turn. Because while some people, viewers, strangers, even online commenters, rushed to judge Lula, something very human started to unfold. Sympathy. People began to relate. Other women stepped forward, anonymously or in support groups, admitting, "I almost left too. There were nights I packed a bag." Sometimes it's not about not loving your child. It's about losing yourself so completely, you don't know how to keep breathing. It shook the narrative. This wasn't a cold, heartless woman. This was a symbol of something deeper, the invisible battles millions of people fight every single day. And the media, they began to look closer, because Lula wasn't the first woman to vanish quietly under the weight of motherhood, poverty, or mental health struggles. And tragically, she wouldn't be the last. But most of all, the spotlight turned to Tammy. Can you imagine living your whole life wondering if you were abandoned, or if your mother had been murdered? Imagine trying to love someone who never came back, and then one day, she's found, but doesn't want to reunite. That's the kind of heartbreak you can't explain. It sits in the throat, heavy, unfinished. Yet Tammy, now in her 40s, handled it with the kind of grace people write novels about. She didn't press charges. She didn't demand attention. She didn't exploit the story for fame. Instead, she gave the most powerful interview you could imagine. When asked what she'd say to her mother if they ever met again, she simply said, "I hope you found peace, and I hope you know, I never stopped looking." Those words went viral, not because they were dramatic, but because they were real. And in a world where headlines are often loud and brutal, her quiet strength broke through the noise. This case sparked more than just headlines. It sparked change. After Lula was found, Indiana authorities and national missing persons organizations revisited hundreds of cold cases involving adults who disappeared without signs of foul play. It led to the development of better cross-state data sharing, more advanced facial recognition use in aging photos, and even encouraged the families of long-term missing adults to never give up hope, no matter how much time had passed. Because if a young mother could vanish in 1974 and be found alive in 2016, then truly anything is possible. It also forced investigators and mental health professionals to take a closer look at what it means to go missing. Sometimes the missing aren't buried, they're just lost, living in plain sight, hiding behind new names, surviving silently, and perhaps the greatest tragedy is that they believe no one cares anymore. But Tammy cared, and because of her, her faith, her search, her refusal to let time erase the truth, her mother's story didn't end in 1974. It was resurrected, and though Lula never stepped into a courtroom or faced a media frenzy, the world still learned something from her: that the human spirit is complicated, that the reasons people run can be as painful as the consequences, and that sometimes closure doesn't come with justice, but with understanding. Lula Gillespie-Miller lived out her remaining years quietly. No press conferences, no apologies in front of cameras, no dramatic reunions with her family, but her story, in a quiet way, kept echoing, not just because she was found, but because she was searched for. Tammy never spoke badly about her mother, even after discovering she had been alive all along. Instead, she used her voice to become a quiet advocate, telling others with missing loved ones, "Don't give up, even if it's been decades. Even if you've stopped hoping, search one more time." Because sometimes, even after 42 years, answers are still out there. And for every viewer watching this, ask yourself, what would you do if someone you loved simply walked away one day and vanished? Would you keep looking? Would you be angry? Would you forgive them if they were finally found? These are the uncomfortable questions that true stories like Lula's force us to confront. This wasn't just a case, it was a reflection of life, of brokenness, of healing, of the hard truth that people don't always disappear because they're taken. Sometimes, they disappear because they're breaking inside and no one noticed. And so, the name Lula Gillespie-Miller doesn't belong to the headlines anymore. It belongs to history, to healing, to hope. And for every missing person out there, whether gone for days or decades, remember this: someone is still looking, someone still cares, and one day, like Lula, you might finally be found. If this story moved you, if it opened your eyes to the silent battles people face, then help us keep stories like Lula's alive. Like this video, leave a comment below, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true stories that matter. And most importantly, share this with someone who needs to hear that even after 42 years, hope is never truly gone.